Her family cheated us out of support and love by hiding her illness, so I took the stage at their charity gala and ruined their reputation with the truth. They say blood is thicker than water, but I learned that sometimes blood can be poison. When my wife's family kicked me out for defending her during her difficult period, I thought I was making the ultimate sacrifice for love. I endured exile, financial ruin, and social ostracism rather than abandon the woman I'd promised to stand by in sickness and in health. For 2 years I wore their rejection like a badge of honor, proof of my unwavering loyalty. Then I overheard a conversation that revealed the truth. They'd known about Emma's medical condition all along, and they'd deliberately sabotaged our marriage to protect their inheritance. What followed wasn't forgiveness. It was the most calculated vindication of my life. Looking back now, I can see that I was the perfect mark for their Ryan Mitchell, 32 years old, successful marketing executive with a respectable but not spectacular family background, desperately eager to belong to something greater than myself. The Morrison family represented everything I'd aspired to but never quite achieved: old money, social influence, the kind of generational wealth that opened doors I didn't even know existed. When I married Emma Morrison 3 years ago, I thought I'd won the lottery. Not just because Emma was beautiful, intelligent, and everything I'd ever wanted in a partner, but because I was being welcomed into a family that treated me like the son they'd never had. Richard Morrison, who'd built a real estate empire from a single property management company, took me under his wing like a mentor. Patricia Morrison, whose charity work had earned her recognition from the mayor's office, included me in her social circle as if I'd been born to it. Emma's siblings, Jonathan, the investment banker, and Sarah, the corporate lawyer, embraced me as their brother with a warmth that filled a space I hadn't realized was empty. For 3 years, I was the golden boy's son-in-law. Every Sunday dinner at the Morrison Mansion was a masterclass in how successful families operated. Every holiday gathering was a celebration of achievement and ambition. Every business connection Richard made on my behalf was an investment in what he called our family's future. I built my marketing firm with their support, expanded my client base through their network, and constructed my entire professional identity around being part of their dynasty. Emma and I were happy during those early years. We lived in a beautiful townhouse that Richard had helped us purchase, entertained regularly in circles that would have been impossible for me to access alone, and planned a future that seemed to stretch endlessly ahead of us. Emma worked as a freelance graphic designer, projects that came through family connections but showcased her genuine talent and creativity. We talked about children, about expanding the business, about the life we'd build together as part of this remarkable family that had adopted me so completely. The changes in Emma started gradually, so subtly that I initially dismissed them as normal fluctuations in mood and energy that everyone experiences. She became more tired than usual, often canceling evening plans in favor of early bedtimes. Her appetite decreased, and she lost weight in a way that concerned me but that she attributed to stress from a particularly demanding client project. More troubling were the personality shifts that seemed to come from nowhere. Emma had always been even-tempered, but she began having mood swings that ranged from euphoric highs to devastating lows within the same day. She'd become irritable over minor inconveniences, then apologize profusely as if she didn't understand her own reactions. Some days she seemed confused about things that should have been routine, forgetting appointments, losing track of conversations, struggling to complete design projects that would normally take her a few hours. The secrecy was what worried me most. Emma had always been open about her work, her friendships, her family relationships, but she started having hushed phone conversations that ended abruptly when I entered the room. She'd receive text messages that made her face go pale, then claim they were from clients or friends I'd never heard her mention. Her laptop, which had always been casually accessible, suddenly required passwords and privacy settings that hadn't existed before. When I expressed concern about these changes, Emma became defensive in ways that were completely out of character. She accused me of being controlling, of not trusting her to manage her own life, of treating her like a child who couldn't handle her own affairs. These accusations stung because they were so unlike the woman I'd married, and because they came with an emotional intensity that seemed disproportionate to my gentle inquiries about her well-being. The financial irregularities were subtle but persistent. Emma had always been responsible with money, but I started noticing unexplained expenses in our joint accounts. Charges for medical consultations, prescription medications, and therapeutic services that she couldn't or wouldn't explain. When I asked about them, she'd claim they were for routine checkups or stress management. But the frequency and amounts suggested something far more significant than preventive care. Her sleep patterns became erratic in ways that affected our entire household routine. Some nights she'd be awake until dawn, pacing through our house with restless energy that seemed to come from nowhere. Other nights she'd fall asleep at 7 in the evening and sleep for 14 hours straight, waking disoriented and exhausted despite the extended rest. Most concerning was the way Emma began withdrawing from family gatherings. She'd always been the center of attention at Morrison family events, the daughter-in-law who could make Richard laugh and help Patricia organize charitable fundraisers. But she started begging off from Sunday dinners, claiming illness or work deadlines that seemed suspiciously convenient. When she did attend, she was quiet, withdrawn, and obviously uncomfortable in ways that made everyone else feel awkward. The Morrison family noticed these changes long before they said anything to me directly. I'd catch meaningful glances between Richard and Patricia when Emma canceled plans at the last minute. Jonathan and Sarah would ask careful questions about how Emma was handling stress and whether we'd considered professional help for what they delicately termed her recent difficulties. These conversations always felt like they contained subtext I wasn't quite grasping, implications that danced around the edges of direct accusation. At first, I was grateful for their concern. Here was a family that loved Emma enough to worry about her well-being, that wanted to help us navigate whatever challenges we were facing. I shared their observations about Emma's behavioral changes, hoping that their perspective might help me understand what was happening to my wife. I assumed we were all on the same team, all working together to figure out how to support Emma through whatever she was experiencing. The family interventions started as gentle suggestions. Patricia would mention therapists who specialized in stress management, or nutritionists who help people maintain energy during demanding work periods. Richard would offer to connect us with medical professionals he knew through his business network, doctors who understood the unique pressures faced by successful families. Jonathan and Sarah would share stories about friends who'd benefited from various wellness programs and treatment approaches. But as Emma's condition became more apparent, their suggestions became more insistent. They began questioning my judgment in ways that felt less supportive and more accusatory. Why wasn't I insisting that Emma seek professional help? How could I enable her obvious problems by pretending everything was normal? What kind of husband allowed his wife to deteriorate without taking action to protect her and the family's reputation? The pressure intensified during family gatherings where Emma's struggles were impossible to hide. She'd arrive late, obviously distressed, sometimes wearing clothes that suggested she'd dressed hastily or without attention to her usual standards. Her contributions to conversations became increasingly erratic, sometimes brilliant insights that reminded everyone why they loved her, sometimes confused statements that made no sense in context. I found myself constantly running interference, making excuses for Emma's behavior while trying to shield her from the family's growing disapproval. I'd explain away her absences, cover for her social missteps, and deflect questions about her well-being, with reassurances that everything was fine, just a rough patch that we'd work through together. The family's patience with my protective stance began wearing thin. They started having conversations with me away from Emma, expressing concerns that felt more like accusations. They questioned whether I was enabling destructive behavior, whether my loyalty was actually harming Emma by preventing her from getting help she obviously needed. They suggested that my reluctance to acknowledge the severity of her problems was motivated by selfishness rather than love. These conversations left me feeling isolated and defensive. I was caught between my wife, who clearly needed support but refused to explain what was happening, and her family, who seemed to know more about her condition than they were willing to admit directly. I felt like everyone was speaking in code, dancing around truths that no one would state clearly enough for me to understand and address. The breaking point came during a Sunday dinner that will be forever burned into my memory. Emma arrived 45 minutes late, her hair uncombed and her clothes wrinkled in ways that suggested she'd slept in them. She was disoriented, struggling to follow the conversation, and obviously unwell in ways that couldn't be hidden or explained away. Patricia's disapproval was palpable from the moment Emma walked into the dining room. Richard's usual warmth was replaced by barely concealed frustration. Jonathan and Sarah exchanged glances that spoke volumes about conversations they'd been having without me. The entire family seemed to have reached some kind of collective decision about Emma that they hadn't bothered to include me in. Emma tried to participate in the dinner conversation, but her contributions were increasingly confused and inappropriate. She'd respond to questions that hadn't been asked, or launch into stories that had no connection to the topics being discussed. At one point, she began laughing at something that wasn't funny, a high-pitched sound that made everyone at the table visibly uncomfortable. When she excused herself to use the bathroom and didn't return for 20 minutes, I went to check on her and found her sitting on the floor of the guest bathroom, crying in a way that suggested complete emotional breakdown. Her distress was so profound that I couldn't imagine how the family expected me to handle it alone, without professional help or family support. I helped Emma compose herself and returned to the dining room, where the family was waiting with expressions that ranged from disappointment to outright anger. The conversation that followed was presented as an intervention, but it felt more like a trial where the verdict had already been decided. Ryan, Richard began, his voice carrying the authority that had built his business empire. We need to have a serious conversation about Emma's condition and your responsibility as her husband. Patricia's contribution was sharper, less diplomatic than her husband's approach. Emma is embarrassing herself and this family with behavior that's becoming impossible to ignore. People in our social circle are asking questions that we're running out of ways to answer. Jonathan, ever the investment banker, framed the problem in terms of risk management. Emma's instability is affecting the family's reputation and, by extension, our business relationships. This situation has moved beyond personal concern into territory that affects all of us professionally. Sarah, with her lawyer's precision, outlined what they saw as the only acceptable solutions. Emma needs immediate professional intervention, psychiatric evaluation, medical treatment, whatever it takes to address these obvious problems. And you need to take control of this situation instead of enabling her decline. Their words felt like an assault, a coordinated attack on both Emma and me that had clearly been planned and rehearsed. They spoke about my wife like she was a problem to be managed rather than a person who was suffering. They talked about her condition as if it were a choice she was making to inconvenience them rather than something she was struggling to understand and control. Emma is my wife, I said, my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest. She's going through something difficult, but she's not a problem to be solved or a reputation risk to be managed. She's a human being who deserves support from the people who claim to love her. The family's response to my defense was swift and unforgiving. Richard's face darkened with an anger I'd never seen directed at me before. Patricia's disappointment was sharp enough to cut glass. Jonathan and Sarah looked at me like I'd revealed myself to be fundamentally different from the person they'd thought they knew. Your loyalty is admirable but misguided, Richard said, his voice carrying the chill of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Emma's problems are affecting this entire family, and your refusal to acknowledge the severity of the situation is part of the problem. We've tried to be patient, Patricia added, but your enabling behavior is making everything worse. Emma needs professional help, and you need to stop protecting her from consequences that might motivate her to seek treatment. The ultimatum, when it came, was delivered with the kind of cold precision that characterized all their business decisions. Either I would take immediate action to address Emma's problems, involuntary psychiatric evaluation, aggressive medical intervention, whatever was necessary to restore her to acceptable behavior, or I would lose my place in the family and everything that came with it. Choose carefully, Ryan, Richard said, his voice carrying implications that extended far beyond family relationships. The business partnerships, the social connections, the financial support, all of it depends on your willingness to do what's necessary for this family's well-being. I looked around the table at these people who'd welcomed me as a son, who'd built their lives around principles of loyalty and family unity, who were now demanding that I betray my wife to maintain my position in their hierarchy. The choice they were offering wasn't really a choice at all. It was a demand that I abandon my principles to preserve my privileges. No, I said, the word feeling like the most important I'd ever spoken. I won't abandon Emma when she needs me most. I won't force her into treatment she hasn't consented to. And I won't choose my relationship with you over my marriage to her. The silence that followed was deafening. Then Patricia spoke, her voice carrying the finality of someone closing a door that would never open again. Then you're no longer welcome in this family, Ryan. And you're no longer welcome in our home. The banishment was swift and comprehensive. Within a week, my business partnerships with Morrison-connected companies were terminated. The social invitations stopped arriving. The networking opportunities that had been the foundation of my professional success evaporated as if they'd never existed. Friends who'd been part of the Morrison social circle suddenly became unavailable, their loyalty clearly lying with a family that had more to offer than I ever could. The financial consequences were devastating but predictable. Without the Morrison network, my client base shrank to a fraction of its previous size. The townhouse we'd purchased with Richard's help became financially untenable, forcing us to downsize to a modest apartment that reflected our new economic reality. The comfortable lifestyle I'd built around family connections crumbled as quickly as it had been constructed. Emma's reaction to my choice was complicated and heartbreaking. She was grateful for my loyalty but consumed with guilt about the cost of my decision. She knew what I'd given up for her, understood the magnitude of what defending her had cost our future, and the weight of that knowledge seemed to worsen whatever she was already struggling with. You should have chosen them, she'd say during her darker moments. You had a good life before me, and now you have nothing because you were too stubborn to admit that I'm broken. But Emma wasn't broken. She was sick, though I still didn't understand with what or how seriously. The isolation from the Morrison family meant losing access to their resources and connections, but it also meant freedom from their constant criticism and pressure. For the first time since her symptoms had begun, Emma could focus on her health without worrying about how her condition affected the family's reputation. We found new doctors, specialists who weren't connected to the Morrison network, but who approached Emma's symptoms with compassion rather than judgment. We began the slow process of rebuilding our lives without the scaffolding of family support, creating routines and relationships based on our actual needs rather than social expectations. The months following our exile were difficult but revealing. Stripped of the Morrison family's influence and resources, we discovered which aspects of our life had been genuine and which had been performance. Our marriage, tested by crisis and isolation, proved to be stronger than I'd realized. Emma's condition, while still mysterious and challenging, became manageable when we could address it honestly instead of hiding it from family scrutiny. I was working late one evening, trying to salvage a client relationship that seemed to be slipping away, when I heard Emma on the phone in our bedroom. Her voice was distressed in a way that immediately caught my attention, but it was the response from whoever she was talking to that made me stop and listen more carefully. "I can't keep lying to him, Dr. Peterson," Emma was saying, her voice thick with tears. "He gave up everything for me, and he doesn't even know what he was defending. His family knew exactly what was wrong with me, and they used it against us both." The voice on the other end was too quiet for me to hear clearly, but Emma's responses painted a picture that made my blood run cold. "They've known about my diagnosis for over a year," she continued. "Patricia was at my first neurologist appointment. She insisted on coming with me for family support. They know I have early-onset Huntington's disease. They know it's degenerative, that it affects my behavior and cognition, that it's genetic and could affect our children." My legs gave out, and I had to lean against the wall to keep from falling. Huntington's disease. I'd heard of it, knew enough to understand that it was serious, hereditary, and incurable. Emma had been dealing with a devastating neurological condition while I'd been defending her against accusations of instability and behavioral problems that were actually symptoms of a disease she couldn't control. "They wanted Ryan to divorce me before I got worse," Emma was saying, her voice breaking completely. "Patricia said it would be merciful to end the marriage before I became a burden. Richard talked about protecting the family's genetic legacy. They thought if they made my symptoms seem like character flaws instead of medical issues, Ryan would eventually give up on me." The conversation continued, but I couldn't hear anything over the roar of fury building in my chest. The Morrison family hadn't just failed to support Emma during a medical crisis. They'd actively sabotaged our marriage by hiding her diagnosis and framing her symptoms as behavioral problems. They'd let me defend her against accusations they knew were false. Let me sacrifice my relationship with them for principles they deliberately undermined. When Emma ended the call, I waited several minutes before entering our bedroom, using the time to process what I'd learned and plan how to respond. Emma was sitting on our bed, looking smaller and more fragile than I'd ever seen her, the weight of her secrets and guilt finally visible without disguise. "Emma," I said gently, sitting beside her and taking her hands in mine, "I heard your conversation with Dr. Peterson. I need you to tell me everything." The confession that followed was devastating in its completeness. Emma had been experiencing symptoms for almost 2 years before her diagnosis, but she'd hidden them out of fear and shame. When the neurological testing confirmed Huntington's disease, Patricia had insisted on being involved in all medical discussions, claiming family support while actually gathering information to use against Emma. The Morrison family had known from the beginning that Emma's behavioral changes were symptoms of a progressive neurological disease. They'd known that her condition would worsen over time, that she'd eventually require significant care, and that any children we had would face a 50% chance of inheriting the same devastating illness. Instead of supporting Emma through her diagnosis, or helping us understand and plan for her condition, they'd seen her illness as a threat to their family's image and future. Patricia had convinced Emma to hide the diagnosis from me, claiming that knowledge would only cause unnecessary worry. Richard had suggested that Emma's condition made her unsuitable for marriage and motherhood, that the kindest thing would be to end our relationship before I became trapped by obligation and pity. The family had systematically undermined Emma's confidence and self-worth, convincing her that her disease made her a burden rather than someone deserving of love and support. They'd encouraged her to push me away, to create distance in our marriage that would make an eventual divorce seem natural rather than abandonment. When their subtle manipulation hadn't worked fast enough, they'd escalated to direct pressure on me to recognize Emma's problems and take action to address them. They'd framed her medical symptoms as character flaws, her neurological struggles as choices she was making to embarrass the family. "They told me you'd leave eventually anyway," Emma said through tears that seemed to come from a place deeper than grief. "They said once you understood how bad it would get, once you saw what this disease would do to me, you'd realize you couldn't handle it. They thought they were protecting you from making a mistake you'd regret." The betrayal was so comprehensive, so calculated, that it took me hours to fully understand its scope. The Morrison family had used Emma's illness against both of us, manipulating her shame and fear to destroy our marriage, while positioning themselves as the concerned relatives trying to help everyone make difficult but necessary decisions. They'd known I was defending my wife against accusations based on medical symptoms she couldn't control. They'd watched me sacrifice my relationship with them, my business connections, and my financial security to protect Emma from family pressure that was based on complete lies. They'd let me burn my bridges for principles they'd deliberately undermined, all while knowing the truth that would have changed everything. The rage I felt was unlike anything I'd experienced before. It was cold, calculating, and focused with laser precision on the people who'd caused so much unnecessary pain through their manipulation and deception. But more than rage, I felt a sense of clarity about what needed to happen next. The Morrison family had used their knowledge of Emma's condition as a weapon against us both. They'd hidden behind concern and family loyalty, while systematically destroying our marriage and my relationship with them. They'd gambled that Emma's shame about her diagnosis would keep their manipulation secret, and that my exile from the family would prevent me from ever learning the truth. They'd gambled wrong. Over the following weeks, I began assembling evidence of the Morrison family's deception with the same methodical approach I'd once used for marketing campaigns. I gathered Emma's medical records, documenting the timeline of her diagnosis and the family's involvement in her care decisions. I collected financial records showing how they'd withdrawn support from our business ventures immediately after I'd refused to abandon Emma. I researched Huntington's disease extensively, understanding both its medical implications and the social stigma that the family had exploited. Most importantly, I began reaching out to medical professionals, legal experts, and advocacy organizations that could help me understand the full scope of what the Morrison family had done. Their manipulation of Emma's medical information, their interference in our marriage based on genetic discrimination, and their systematic deception constituted patterns of behavior that might have legal as well as social consequences. The evidence-gathering phase took 3 months, during which I maintained the appearance of someone focused solely on rebuilding our life after exile. I didn't confront the Morrison family or make any direct accusations. Instead, I quietly built a comprehensive case that documented their deception and manipulation with the kind of detail that would make denial impossible. Emma's involvement in planning our response was crucial but emotionally difficult. She'd been living with shame about her condition for so long that the idea of making it public felt terrifying. But she also understood that the Morrison family's manipulation had harmed other people beyond just us, and that their behavior needed to be exposed to prevent future victims. "They'll do this to other people," Emma said during one of our planning sessions. "They'll use whatever leverage they can find to control family members and protect their reputation. Someone needs to show the community who they really are." We decided that our response needed to be public, comprehensive, and timed for maximum impact. The Morrison family's social standing was built on community respect and business relationships that depended on their reputation for integrity and family values. Exposing their manipulation and deception in a public forum would destroy the foundation of their influence more effectively than any private confrontation. The opportunity came with the announcement of the Morrison Family Foundation's annual charity gala, a black tie event that drew the city's business and social elite. Richard and Patricia would be receiving a humanitarian award for their philanthropic work, with extensive media coverage and community recognition for their generous support of medical research initiatives. The irony was perfect. They'd be celebrated for supporting medical research while having systematically discriminated against their own daughter-in-law for having a genetic condition. The public nature of the event would ensure maximum exposure for our revelations, while the media presence would guarantee that their response would be documented and scrutinized. I spent weeks preparing for the gala, crafting a presentation that would expose the Morrison family's deception with surgical precision. I gathered supporting documentation, coordinated with advocacy organizations that could provide expert commentary, and arranged for media contacts who could ensure that our story received proper coverage. Emma initially resisted the idea of attending the gala, fearing that her presence would seem confrontational or attention-seeking. But I convinced her that her voice was essential to the story, that the community needed to hear directly from the person who'd been most harmed by the family's manipulation. "They used your illness against you," I reminded her. "They turned your medical condition into a weapon to destroy our marriage and isolate you from support. Your presence at their celebration will show everyone that you're not ashamed of who you are, and that their manipulation didn't work." The night of the gala arrived with the kind of crisp autumn weather that made everything feel sharp and clear. Emma and I dressed carefully for the occasion, not in the expensive formal wear that had characterized our previous appearances at Morrison. Family events, but in simple, elegant clothing that reflected our new reality while maintaining appropriate respect for the formal setting. We arrived at the hotel ballroom where the gala was being held just as the cocktail hour was transitioning to dinner service. The reaction to our presence was immediate and electric. Conversations stopped mid-sentence as people noticed us, whispers spread through the crowd like wildfire, and all eyes turned toward the Morrison family table where Richard and Patricia were receiving congratulations for their humanitarian award. Richard's face went through a series of expressions when he saw us: surprise, confusion, and then a cold anger that he tried to mask behind his public persona. Patricia's reaction was sharper, less controlled, her disapproval written clearly across features that were usually schooled to diplomatic neutrality. Jonathan and Sarah flanked their parents like bodyguards, their lawyer and banker instincts kicking in as they assessed the potential threat our presence represented. The entire family seemed to understand instinctively that our appearance at their celebration wasn't coincidental or conciliatory. We found seats at a table with business associates who'd maintained relationships with me, despite the Morrison family's disapproval. People who'd respected my professional integrity enough to continue working with me even after my exile from the family social circle. Their support felt like validation that my choice to defend Emma had been recognized and appreciated by people whose opinions mattered. During the dinner service, I watched Richard and Patricia accept their humanitarian award with speeches about the importance of supporting medical research and helping families affected by genetic conditions. The irony was so profound that I had to grip my water glass to keep my hands from shaking with suppressed fury. The Morrison Family Foundation believes that no family should face genetic illness alone, Patricia said into the microphone, her voice carrying the practiced compassion of someone accustomed to public speaking. Our research support aims to find treatments and cures that will spare future generations from the suffering caused by hereditary diseases. Richard's contribution focused on the importance of community support for families dealing with medical challenges. When someone we love faces a genetic condition, our response defines our character as a family and as a community. We must choose compassion over fear, support over stigma, love over judgment. The applause that followed their speeches was enthusiastic and sustained, reflecting genuine admiration for their philanthropic work and public commitment to medical research. No one in that ballroom knew that these same people had systematically discriminated against their own daughter-in-law for having exactly the kind of genetic condition they claimed to support. When the awards presentation concluded and the evening moved toward closing remarks, I stood and approached the podium. The Master of Ceremonies, recognizing me as a former member of the Morrison family circle, handed me the microphone with the assumption that I was there to offer additional tribute to the evening's honorees. "Thank you," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the ballroom's sound system. "I'm Ryan Mitchell, and I was part of the Morrison family until I was exiled for defending my wife Emma, who has early-onset Huntington's disease." The silence that followed was complete and deafening. Every conversation stopped, every clink of silverware ceased, every whisper died away as the ballroom's attention focused entirely on my words. "The Morrison family has known about Emma's diagnosis for over a year," I continued, my voice steady despite the magnitude of what I was revealing. They attended her medical appointments, participated in treatment discussions, and had complete knowledge of her condition and prognosis. I could see Richard and Patricia at their table, their faces frozen in expressions of shock and growing horror as they realized what was happening. Jonathan and Sarah were whispering urgently to each other, their legal training no doubt focusing on damage control and crisis management. Instead of supporting Emma through her diagnosis, the Morrison family chose to use her illness against her. They convinced her to hide her condition from me, framed her medical symptoms as character flaws, and systematically undermined our marriage to pressure her into divorce. The details I'd spent months documenting spilled out in careful sequence: Patricia's manipulation of Emma's medical appointments, Richard's suggestions that genetic illness made Emma unsuitable for marriage, the family's coordination to withdraw support from our business and social relationships when I refused to abandon my wife. When I defended Emma against what I thought were unfair accusations about her behavior, I was actually defending her against symptoms of a neurological disease that the Morrison family knew she couldn't control. They let me sacrifice my relationship with them, my business connections, and my financial security to protect Emma from family pressure that was based on complete lies. The documentation I'd prepared was distributed to media representatives and community leaders throughout the ballroom. Medical records confirming Emma's diagnosis and the family's involvement, financial records showing the systematic withdrawal of support, and correspondence that revealed the calculating nature of their manipulation. The Morrison family received a humanitarian award tonight for supporting medical research in families affected by genetic conditions, I concluded, my voice carrying the full weight of righteous fury that had been building for months. But they used my wife's genetic condition as a weapon against her, discriminated against her based on her diagnosis, and manipulated both of us to protect their own social and financial interests. The silence that followed my presentation stretched for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. Then the whispers began, urgent conversations between shocked community members who were processing the implications of what they'd just heard. Cameras flashed as media representatives documented the Morrison family's reaction to the accusations. Phones appeared as people began sharing the news with contacts who weren't present to witness the revelation firsthand. Richard Morrison stood slowly, his face ashen but his posture still carrying the authority of someone accustomed to controlling narratives and managing crises. When he approached the podium, I handed him the microphone and returned to my seat, satisfied that I'd presented the truth clearly and completely. His response was everything I'd hoped for and more, a fumbling attempt at damage control that only made the situation worse. He claimed that their actions had been motivated by concern for both Emma and me, that they'd been trying to protect us from making decisions we might regret, that their involvement in Emma's medical care had been appropriate family support rather than manipulation. Patricia's attempt to add context was even more damaging, her explanation revealing exactly the kind of genetic discrimination and social prejudice that advocacy organizations had been fighting for years. She spoke about the family's concerns regarding hereditary illness, the importance of making informed decisions about marriage and children, and the responsibility they felt to protect the family's future generations. The community's reaction was swift and unforgiving. Business leaders who'd built relationships with Morrison Enterprises began questioning their associations with people who demonstrated such fundamental dishonesty and cruelty. Charitable organizations that had accepted Morrison family donations started examining whether they wanted to be connected with people who'd discriminated against someone for having a genetic condition. Social media erupted with commentary about genetic discrimination, family loyalty, and the difference between genuine support and manipulative control. Advocacy organizations seized on the story as an example of exactly the kind of prejudice and stigma that people with genetic conditions faced from their own families. The Morrison family social circle fragmented overnight. Friends and business associates distanced themselves from people who'd been exposed as manipulative and dishonest in such a public forum. The reputation for integrity and family values that had been the foundation of their social influence evaporated as completely as if it had never existed. The business consequences were immediate and comprehensive. Morrison real estate partnerships were dissolved by companies that couldn't afford to be associated with the scandal. Charitable organizations returned donations and ended relationships with the foundation. Social clubs quietly rescinded memberships and canceled event bookings. Most devastating was the impact on their children's careers. Jonathan's investment banking firm launched an internal investigation into his judgment and character, eventually forcing his resignation when client confidence in his integrity became untenable. Sarah's law practice suffered as potential clients questioned whether they wanted representation from someone whose family had been exposed for such systematic deception. The legal implications took longer to develop but proved equally damaging. Advocacy organizations filed complaints with professional licensing boards about the medical professionals who'd allowed the Morrison family to interfere in Emma's care. The state attorney general's office opened an investigation into potential genetic discrimination violations. Civil rights lawyers began discussing precedent-setting lawsuits that could establish new protections for people facing family-based genetic discrimination. For Emma and me, the aftermath of the Gala revelation was transformative in ways we hadn't anticipated. The community support that emerged was overwhelming and genuine. Business contacts who offered partnerships based on respect for my integrity, medical professionals who volunteered their services for Emma's care, and advocacy organizations that welcomed us as voices for genetic condition awareness. My business recovered quickly as clients returned and new opportunities emerged with companies that valued ethical leadership and principled decision-making. The Morrison family connections that I'd lost proved to be less important than the reputation for integrity that I'd gained by defending Emma publicly and consistently. Emma's health management became significantly easier when we could address her condition openly and honestly. With proper medical support and community understanding, her symptoms became manageable aspects of our life, rather than sources of shame and secrecy. She began speaking at advocacy events, sharing her story to help other families navigate genetic conditions without the isolation and discrimination we'd experienced. The transformation in our marriage was profound. The crisis had tested every aspect of our relationship and proven that our bond was strong enough to survive external pressure and internal challenges. We'd discovered that we could trust each other completely, support each other through the worst possible circumstances, and emerge stronger rather than broken. 2 years after the Gala revelation, our life bears no resemblance to the existence we'd built around Morrison family connections. We live modestly but comfortably, our income based on actual work rather than social connections. Our friendships are authentic relationships with people who value integrity over influence. Our marriage is built on complete honesty and mutual support rather than performance and social expectations. Emma's condition has progressed in some ways but remains manageable with proper medical care and community support. She's become an advocate for genetic condition awareness, using her experience with family discrimination to help other people navigate similar challenges. Her work has given her a sense of purpose and empowerment that transforms her relationship with her diagnosis from shame to strength. The Morrison family never recovered from the scandal. Richard and Patricia eventually sold their mansion and moved to another state, their business empire reduced to a fraction of its former size. Jonathan and Sarah relocated as well, rebuilding their careers in markets where the Morrison name carried less baggage. The family foundation was dissolved, its remaining assets distributed to organizations that could use the funds without the tainted association. I feel no satisfaction in their destruction, but I also feel no obligation to minimize the consequences of their choices. They used Emma's illness as a weapon against her and manipulated both of us for their own benefit. The natural results of their deception and cruelty were not my responsibility to prevent or mitigate. The experience taught me that family loyalty means supporting what's right, rather than blindly protecting people who've done wrong. The Morrison family expected me to choose their comfort over Emma's well-being, their reputation over her dignity, their social standing over her basic human rights. When I chose my wife over their demands, they revealed exactly who they were beneath their facade of respectability and family values. More importantly, the crisis taught me that authentic relationships are stronger than convenient ones. The people who supported us through the worst period of our lives proved to be better friends than those who'd abandoned us when supporting us became inconvenient. The community that embraced us after learning the truth provided more genuine connection than the social circle we'd lost when defending Emma became costly. Today, when I speak about our experience at advocacy events or support group meetings, I focus on the positive outcomes, rather than the betrayal that preceded them. We learned that genetic conditions don't define someone's worth or capacity for contribution. We discovered that community support can replace family dysfunction when necessary. We proved that principled decisions, even costly ones, ultimately lead to better outcomes than convenient compromises. The Morrison family thought they were manipulating two naive people who would accept their version of reality rather than fight for the truth. They assumed that Emma's shame about her condition would keep her silent, and that my desire to belong to their family would override my commitment to my wife. They underestimated both of us, and they underestimated the power of community accountability when the truth finally emerges. Sometimes the best revenge isn't personal at all. It's simply ensuring that people face the natural consequences of their choices, and that the community understands exactly who they're dealing with. Emma and I built something better from the ashes of what they destroyed. We learned that love isn't performance, that family isn't obligation, and that integrity isn't negotiable regardless of the cost. The Morrison family lost everything they'd built around image and influence, but we gained something far more valuable, a life based on authenticity, principle, and genuine connection. In the end, they did us a favor by revealing their true character before we'd wasted any more time trying to earn the approval of people who were fundamentally incapable of genuine love or loyalty. Sometimes the greatest gift your enemies can give you is the clarity to see exactly who they are, and the motivation to build something infinitely better without them.